Hi, my name is Eric Raboin. This is my presentation for our final project. It is titled Adventure into Colombia. Colombia is located in northern South America, where it shares a border with countries such as Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, Panama, with its capital being Bogota. It's largely Spanish speaking and known in popular culture for Shakira, who's a popular pop artist. Their music style is very popular as well internationally. Recently, the Netflix series Narcos has a huge focus on Colombia itself. And speaking of, Pablo Escobar was a notorious Colombian drug lord during the 80s and 90s and was from Colombia, which is why a lot of Colombia is known for, that kind of era in terms of popular culture. They largely speak Spanish, 99.5% of them do. They are largely Roman Catholic. Over 90% of the population is a Roman Catholic religion, likely stemming from when the Spanish first arrived to South America a couple hundred years ago and they colonized, that area. The population count is about 50 million people, so a good amount of people live there in Colombia, but it is a fraction of, say, the population of America, which would make sense given the size. However, the population in cities is relatively dense, where there's a lot of forest ground and everything as well. So there's a lot of land that really isn't inhabited, but the ones that are can be pretty densely populated. My business venture idea for the final project would be to act as an intermediary or a middleman for American investors and Colombian businesses. Now, this would essentially work as in investors from either America or really, any international country would want to make deals with Colombia, being an emerging developing country, but the customs, the language, the procedures are all very different from what they're used to in their countries. So our idea would be to kind of work as a business and kind of translate for people, work together, communicate between each other, and negotiate deals to get the Colombian businesses investment money and also to get the American investors what they're looking for, and also to try to make sure it's all facilitated as smoothly as possible. Why I would choose this is Colombia is an emerging tech hub. It's one of the best tech hubs in South America in terms of, network communications. Even the internet is the best in South America in terms of reliability. Some countries in South America, even the electricity can be spotty, and in Colombia is one of the most reliable areas for that as well. So when you're running a business, especially one that would be, communicating internationally, it's going to be largely a communications, internet, telecommunications business, which means you're going to want the best areas for that, which happens to be Colombia. There's different business styles between the two countries, or really between Colombia and many different countries, would kind of put people off. You have, companies looking to invest or individuals looking to invest who may not understand how business is done in Colombia. As such, you'll want to make sure that, you have a middleman or an intermediary who can understand what each country operates, how they operate in terms of cultural communications, and how their just work ethic, business styles, and everything kind of go, because that way you can work with them, understand their needs, and translate that for the other culture. And as it says here, even investors need people with Colombian knowledge. That was essentially a synopsis of what I just gave. The knowledge being that you would understand how everything works in Colombia and could translate that to the international audiences. As far as Colombian work culture goes, the business has been changing. As of about 10 years ago, it was very strict. You showed up, you were extremely punctual, you had to do your tasks. But it's becoming a little more modern over recent years, where it's more of a kind of American culture almost in a way in some regards, but also in other regards, It's not. It's definitely a mix of new and old business styles. In terms of, say, before the boss would have the say over everything, and the workers would just kind of do their task and go home when their task is done. But now they're kind of embracing more of a kind of open communication style where employees are encouraged to kind of speak up a little bit more, and the bosses are trying to kind of be less of a one-man army in terms of decisions, where just not the boss is the only one making the decisions anymore. Punctuality is very, very important in Colombian work culture. They will show up on time, and generally they will work until they finish their tasks that they're assigned to, even if it means staying late or working on a weekend. They take it very seriously, the work that they get assigned and the tasks that they have to do, and as a result, they'll actually work as long as they need to, in terms of it. Which personal appearance also for them is extremely important. As you can see on the image here, there's two Colombian business people, and you can see that they're very well dressed, in terms of, nice pants, suit jacket, button-up shirt. She's wearing nice dress pants, nice blouse, nice jacket. So all of that shows that, they do take pride in their personal appearance, and they think that, it's important in terms of how they work and working in the business offices, and doing their tasks that way. American work culture, this is something we're all a little more familiar with. Definitely a more modern work culture where, bosses and their subordinates are essentially treated as equal people. The boss will still be able to make decisions and choices, but the important thing is, employees do have a say, and there are laws and, government agencies and things to ensure that there's a fair and good workplace for Americans here in this country. It's a non-personal typically, where people go to work, they do their job, they go home. They don't really spend a lot of time fostering personal connections in the office or in the workplace. Of course, there's exceptions to every rule, but that does tend to be the norm for American culture, is that they'll just go into work 9 to 5, and then they'll go and they'll see their friends, family, spend time like that. But they usually won't spend too much time talking about it or be overtly open to people at work. They're very time conscious here in America, so when I say, they work 9 to 5, generally we work 9 to 5. What that means is when it's time to go home, generally you'll go home unless you're getting paid for it. Compared to Colombian culture, where they'll work until that task is done. Americans, if it's time to go home and the task isn't done, generally they will go home. They won't stay to finish the task. Once again, exceptions to every rule in both work cultures, but that does tend to be the norm. Uh, Very polite in American work culture. Everybody generally respects each other, is polite even if they don't like each other. They'll still be friendly to each other's faces, and they'll interact as much as needed in a professional manner, whereas they don't let potentially personal issues or gripes kind of get in that way, which is something that, many cultures tend to have, but in an American culture, that tends to be a little more overt with what their emotions are and what their feelings and what their opinions are. We do maintain a strong politeness when it comes to the workplace. When looking at both countries' work styles, there's a series of things that need to be taken into consideration. One of the most important ones is the work style differences between both countries. In Colombia, they work very, very hard. They're very punctual, and they have a mix of that old and modern work styles. In America, it is very much just the modern work style. They will not work until a task is finished. They'll work until they no longer want to work anymore. Essentially, when it's 9 to 5, when it hits 5 o'clock, more often than not, they will go home. There's time differences whenever you're dealing with anything internationally. Time zones can be 2 hours apart, they could be 12 hours apart. There's a very substantial difference in terms of which country you're interacting with and who you're working with. Through my research, I didn't see too much about, say, for example, a 24-hour business in Colombia, but I would be inclined to believe that there likely are, given that Colombians tend to be very hardworking and the hour that they leave work doesn't matter to them so much. So I'd be inclined to believe that there are opportunities there to have people be working at any hour of the night to kind of accommodate those time differences. Business styles, and in terms of the communications, very, very different between American and Colombian culture. In Colombian culture, there's a lot more subtlety, and it relies a lot more on tone, uh, body language, kind of just the overall feeling that you get in terms of when you're communicating with them and working with them, say in a meeting, through a video call, so on and so forth. Americans tend to be more overt. If Americans have something that they want to say, generally they will just kind of come out and say it. They won't rely on people picking up on those subtle cues in terms of the body language, the tone, and things such as those. In terms of, being personal, Colombians take much more of a priority over personal relationships, where, sometimes they'll be late to a meeting because they were trying to forge that personal relationship with a client, a coworker, so on and so forth, which is generally seen as okay in Colombian culture, as long as, of course, it doesn't get too excessive. And in American culture, it's a little bit different. We tend to come into work, very little small talk, do our job, keep things very professional, and then we return out of the office to go home or to go out into our personal lives. Where Colombians are a little bit different. They're more likely to kind of see their work employees, their coworkers, as as a family, whereas we really just see our coworkers generally as coworkers, which just kind of ties into those work relationships as well. They're more likely to have actual relationships and friendships with those that they work with, whereas Americans just kind of try to keep it at a professional face value for the most part. Once again, exceptions to every rule, but that does tend to be the case between both cultures. Now, there's series of actions that could be taken in order to minimize these considerations, and improve the effectiveness of the company. Conveying true messages. Essentially, what that would be is if there's subtle cues and there's a subtle tone that the Colombians are giving, we need to convert that into language for the Americans, or if that country tends to be more of an overt country in terms of their language, we need to kind of customize that response and provide it to them in the language in the manner that they're used to and comfortable with. That's speaking to the target audience right there. I'm using Americans and Colombians as an example, but it could be Colombians and, a Japanese company, or it could be Colombians and a Belgian company. You need to look at their model, evaluate their culture to see kind of which way you would need to convey those messages. But in the example of an American company, we would kind of want to take their subtle cues and what they're kind of saying between the lines and turn that into just a forthright, this is the situation. However, we'll want to kind of swap that vice versa as well. So when the Americans are very direct with us, we'll need to translate that into a subtle response for the Colombians. Therefore, no one feels offended or and their cultures feels respected. A personal appearance code would be important to have in this company, especially if there would be American and Colombian employees. Keeping things for the personal appearance at an even level would may kind of impact negatively on the American side of things, but would make the Colombians feel more comfortable with the modern and new style of American work culture likely being incorporated into this business. It would be a nice kind of trade-off there. Whereas some Colombians may feel more uncomfortable with the work culture, but at least they'll feel more comfortable with, how everyone's dressing, how everyone's kind of conducting themselves, and all that. Allowing paid overtime would also be another way to really kind of bolster the Colombian side of things. It would also help out Americans because generally Americans won't work extra unless they're getting paid for it. So by avoiding that just kind of salary pay where there's no real calculated overtime, This would allow both Colombians to work harder and get paid for it, and Americans to work harder and get paid for it. So that kind of cultural difference where Colombians might feel obligated to work later than an American will hopefully at least be compensated with overtime pay. Having regular meetings and some of those meetings fostering personal connections in terms of team building exercises, getting to know each other, cultural experiences, I think would go a long way in terms of the actions that could be taken in order to foster camaraderie and improve those personal connections. With these meetings, it would help kind of keep a structure and an organization to the company. And also by incorporating some of these get to know yous or really kind of experiences culturally between each other, it's going to kind of improve that camaraderie that I mentioned earlier and really foster a strong relationship between both countries, both cultures, and the employees that work between both locations. Over the past several weeks, I've learned quite a bit about cultural communication through this course. One of the main ones that has been a takeaway for me is understanding the inherent biases that we may have. So, before this course, I didn't really consider the biases that I may take into consideration when talking with people, working with people. I have had some experience in the past understanding when I've had a bias and adjusting in terms of it to kind of compensate for that. However, in the same token of respect, I didn't really kind of think about it all the time. After this class and from the learnings that I've kind of taken, taken a lot longer emphasis on that, whereas I really focus on if I'm exercising one of those inherent or subconscious biases or not, and if so, how that's affecting or adjusting my decisions or my thought processes about a certain situation. The cultural orientations model has been something I've really learned about as well. Learning about the different divisions, the subdivisions. It really kind of puts words and puts terms to an idea that I already vaguely understood. I certainly understood that there was different ways that we saw ourselves and identified and worked together in terms of it, but really being able to break it down allows you to really evaluate several different cultures with these kind of thoughts in mind. Utilizing that, you can really get an idea of what's important to a culture, what's not important, and how to conduct yourself, which in this business idea that I had would be an important skill and an important part of that business as you work with many different international uh, countries. Different cultural communication aspects. I listed some here, such as idioms, metaphors, and imagery. So, for example, when you're working with someone who may be, native from Japan, you're going to want to avoid using, figures of speech or, saying like, oh, so and so is such a tool, for example, as someone in China may not understand that terminology, whereas that would be much more slang in American culture to say, oh, someone's lame, which is another, you know, kind of slang there that they may not understand. So, utilizing those things is important to understand when they work and when they don't work. And generally, with cultural communication, those are things you'll want to avoid because that'll just increase the likelihood of miscommunication between the two individuals, which you'd want to avoid. Cross cultural conflict is an important thing to learn about as well. Nobody ever wants to potentially offend other people, especially when it becomes to a cultural standpoint. So, by understanding what cross cultural conflict is and possible communication styles, you can really kind of emphasize how to properly communicate with people whether they're your culture or another culture, and still be able to potentially discuss, interact, and not kind of come to any of those issues that may offend, while still potentially experiencing and learning more about that culture. In American society, and especially throughout this course, what I've realized too is many of us have avoided, certain discussions and certain things in our life out of fear of offending people. And I think by really kind of working the communication styles, improving your cultural experiences and encounters, you'll get better at being able to learn and understand these things without potentially worrying about offending or possibly even coming off as offensive. So, with all that in mind, Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I hope I was able to teach you a thing or two about Colombia, and I'm glad to have taken this class to learn quite a bit about cultural communication, understanding how they work in a workplace, and hopefully, especially with my field in computer programming, where I'll be interacting with many different cultures, this will help me in terms of communicating, working together, and fostering relationships going forward in my professional life after school. Thank you once again for listening, and if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or reach out.